yourselves the following questions. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Okay, so before starting today's invocation, Vaishnavi, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Vaishnavi K, Youth Service Director of MES Rotaract Club. I'm going to sing invocation song. ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗಜಮುಖನೇ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗಜಮುಖನೇ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗುರುಕುಲಕ್ಕೆ ವರವಾಗಿ ಗುರಿ ತೋರೋ ಗುರುವಾಗಿ ಪೊರೆ ನೀನು ಎಂದೆಂದು ಕರುನಾಡು ಬಾ ಬಂದು ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗಜಮುಖನೇ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಬಾಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದಾಗಿ ಬಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಯಾಗಿ ಕ್ಷಣ ಕ್ಷಣವು ನಮಗಾಗಿ ನೆರವಾಗು ಬೆಳಕಾಗಿ ಬಾಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದಾಗಿ ಬಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಜೊತೆಯಾಗಿ ಕ್ಷಣ ಕ್ಷಣವು ನಮಗಾಗಿ ನೆರವಾಗು ಬೆಳಕಾಗಿ ದಯೆ ಇರಲಿ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಗತಿ ನೀನೆ ಹಾದಿಯಲಿ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗಜಮುಖನೇ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ವಿಧಿಯಾಗಿ ನಿಧಿಯಾಗಿ ಸುಧೆ ತುಂಬು ಒಲವಾಗಿ ಹಿರಿಯಾದ ಸಿರಿ ನೀನು ಈ ಬಾಳ ಸವಿಜೇನು ವಿಧಿಯಾಗಿ ನಿಧಿಯಾಗಿ ಸುಧೆ ತುಂಬು ಒಲವಾಗಿ ಹಿರಿಯಾದ ಸಿರಿ ನೀನು ಈ ಬಾಳ ಸವಿಜೇನು ದಯೆ ಇರಲಿ ನಮ್ಮಲ್ಲಿ ಗತಿ ನೀನೆ ಹಾದಿಯಲಿ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗಜಮುಖನೇ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಗುರುಕುಲಕ್ಕೆ ವರವಾಗಿ ಗುರಿ ತೋರೋ ಗುರುವಾಗಿ ಪೊರೆ ನೀನು ಎಂದೆಂದು ಕರುನಾಡು ಬಾ ಬಂದು ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ನೀನಮ್ಮ ಗೆಲುವಾಗಿ ಬಾ ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು
Thank you, Vaishnavi, for the invocation. I would like to welcome each and every one of you here for attending this session. First of all, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Chithra Mathur. I would like to welcome our faculty coordinator, Rotarian Veena Nagraj ma'am. I would like to also welcome the Youth Service Director of our parent club, Rotarian Sarasija, the DRS, Rotarian Arun, President Pankaj from RIMS, Vice President Lavanya from RCBS, and also the past President Surya Kiran, who is attending today's session. So thank you all for being here. So this series that we've started, the Women of Vision series, is an initiative of MES Rotaract Club, where every Friday we host a different inspiring woman to share their wisdom and their information and knowledge with us. So today we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Chithra Mathur, who's a PhD researcher and an LGBTQIA activist. So needless to say, this subject, more often than not, is open to a lot of misinterpretation, misrepresentation all over the world. So hence today's presentation by Dr. Mathur is of absolute importance and relevance to each and every one of us who are attending. So I would like to introduce our speaker to all the attendees here. So Chithra Mathur is a PhD researcher in the Public Systems Group at IIM Ahmedabad. Prior to her PhD, she worked in the corporate sector, driving CSR initiatives of various companies after completing an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad and a BTech from IIT Bombay. She has presented her research in conferences across India, UK, Finland, Singapore, and delivered lectures on various topics such as LGBTQIA rights, religious and social discrimination, behavioral and experimental economics at organizations and academic institutions such as IIM Ahmedabad, IIM Bangalore, TISS Mumbai, and National Institute of Design and Ahmedabad University. Her work has been published in the Economic and Political Weekly and several other online portals. She co-founded IIM Ali in 2015, the queer resource group of IIM Ahmedabad, and one of the first such groups in any business school in India. She is a member of LABIA, a queer feminist LBT collective based in Mumbai, and has dabbled in stand-up comedy as a way of talking about her life experiences. So that's a very inspiring profile of ma'am, and I'm sure we're all really excited and looking forward to hearing from ma'am herself. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Chithra Mathur to please address all of us.
Yeah, am I audible? Um, okay, so I think I'll just keep my video off, and as long as I'm audible, I think that's fine. I'll just start sharing my screen. Sorry, just a minute. Okay, so is everyone able to see this slide, which has today's date and on the title? I mean, I've just put a very simple title here, and these are my standard slides for all such talks. Before I begin, just one disclosure. I did not mention myself as Dr. Mathur at any point because I've not yet got my PhD. I'm hoping to get it soon. But anyways, that minor point aside. Um, as I said, these are my standard slides, which take me about a couple of hours to go through, and we have much lesser time, of course. So I will be skipping a lot of things and just focusing on some of the most fundamental stuff, which I think is important to clarify before we get into detailed discussions. And if anyone has any questions, any doubts at any point, then feel free to interrupt and ask me if it is like a very urgent, pertinent question. And if you can hold on till the end of the talk, that's fine as well. And if I'm going too fast, too slow, not audible, whatever it is, just please let me know. So this is just a quick overview. And I think the first point over there is what I'll be starting with, because what I have gathered so far from my interaction with Sharanya is that for a lot of you, this might be a very new topic. So I'll be starting from scratch. I understand that obviously, there are people who are closeted, like I'm not assuming who is queer, who is not queer in the audience, but I am assuming that the majority might be just allies and may not be as familiar with some of these terms and some of the issues that are relevant here. So without further delay, I will move on to the first point over here. And before getting into the acronym, LGBTQIA or whatever, and all the terms that that acronym stands for. Before getting into all of that, I would like you all to look at this diagram. This genderbread person, you can just easily Google for this and find it online. And why I feel it is important to start with this is because from not just in our own lives from the very beginning, in our families, etc., but everywhere in society, in like every aspect of our lives, we see that it is just assumed that the world is divided into two genders, that being heterosexual is the norm, and that gender is a very monolithic concept which everyone assumes that they understand quite well. Which I would like to argue is not, it's not as clear cut as we think it is. And so here, I would like to say that there are at least 5 different aspects to it that you can see over here. I mean, 3 of them specifically relate to gender itself, and 2 others which are related to the part about being attracted to someone or not, which I'll come to later. First, looking at the concept of gender itself, and I'll start from the third one mentioned over here, which is biological sex. This is something which is assigned to all of us at birth. That at the moment a child is born, either the doctors or the parents are the ones to just look at the child and decide that, oh, it's a boy or it's a girl. And in 99% of cases, uh, that decision, at least at a simple biological level, is never questioned throughout that person's life, not even by the person themselves. And so it's fine. I mean, people just assume that's the norm for good reason. However, for a small percentage of cases, at that very point of someone's birth, there might be a visible ambiguity, which can uh, which can basically leave the doctors and the parents, etc., just confused about which box to put this child in, right? And this ambiguity or variance, or whatever we may call it, may not only be in the visible genitalia, it might also be inside the body and therefore not visible immediately. It might be even further hidden in the sense that it might be something about the hormones in the body or the way the hormones function, the receptors, the chromosomes. There are all kinds of biological factors at play. And even if one of them is off, then something or the other is different from the assumed normal, right? And for a lot of, and so broadly, this entire category of people who, in a very clear biological sense, do not fit that definition of a male or female, quote unquote normal, is called intersex. I mean, intersex variations, intersex conditions, whatever you may call it. And of course, there are people nowadays who assume that term as an identity and say that I am an intersex person or an intersex activist. However, a vast majority of intersex people might still be assigned an identity of male or female and might be raised as such, right? So you may not even know that someone, a friend of yours who you just know as a boy or a girl in your college or wherever, might actually have some such condition, which is only known to them, their parents, their doctors, etc., but not to society at large. And this is something which, of course, like medical science, etc., has figured out at least some of the variations that happen and how to deal with them and so on. With one major issue when it comes to talking about rights and about the issues which are being fought about, the one major issue is that a lot of people who fall under this category and then who were forced as babies to undergo surgical procedures or something or the other to make them fit one category or the other, they might grow up and realize that whatever happened to them was wrong, that they do not identify with the category that they were forced into. And so there is a certain sort of movement and a certain argument that is raised that all such surgeries, all such procedures, any intervention in a child's body, no matter what that body looks like, at least in terms of the biological sex, should be delayed until the child is 18 and can make that decision for themselves and decide how they want to live, rather than deciding just on the basis of some doctor's whims or the parents' whims that, oh, I want a boy or I want a girl, or it'll be easier to make this child a boy or a girl or something like that. Right. So that is specifically about intersex people. The second is gender expression, and this is something which is relatively easier for us to discuss. We might have been familiar with this discourse not just in the context of LGBT rights, but in general. I mean, masculinity and femininity is just a wider concept which applies to all of us, right? So there are boys, for example, who may have been effeminate throughout their childhood in school, etc., or who may just like feminine things. And because this concept of masculine and feminine is not just about people, it's also about all our actions, our clothes, all our choices, even our career choices, for example, or all kinds of behaviors. So much of of all these aspects of our lives are gendered and labeled masculine or feminine. And so we all must have known of some feminine boys and masculine girls, tomboys as they're called, and to a large extent, a lot of it is also considered acceptable to some degree, right? So as long as the child exhibits some degree of a different gender expression, but then grows out of it by a certain age and then conforms to the heteronormative norm, then it's considered okay. It is only when that uh, very different kind of gender expression also manifests itself later in terms of expressing a different identity, a different sexual orientation, and so on. That is where trouble with families, etc., comes in. So even within the LGBT community, etc., we find a lot of people, for example, saying that as long as I was dressing up in my siblings' clothes or like whatever, like if a girl says that I was very tomboyish initially, but after say the age of 12 or 13 I was forced into conforming and becoming more feminine, or vice versa, right? A boy might say that, oh, if I was like 5 years old or something and just playing with my mom's makeup or something, that would be considered fine, or that would be considered a joke. And of course, I mean, I'm saying that lightly because in many families, even a 4 or 5 year old could be beaten up for something like this. But definitely beyond the age of 10 or 12, a lot of traditional sort of families might not look at any of this kindly. But gender expression, as I'm saying, is a concept which applies to all of us, and we might feel differently about it, even at different times of the day or different days. Like, I mean, today I might want to look a certain way, tomorrow I might want to look uh, you know uh, present myself differently, and so on. And even when we think about the fact that today it's so common for girls to wear jeans and t-shirts, and a lot of these things were not considered acceptable a few decades ago. So a lot of that kind of masculinity has been co-opted and is, I mean, it has been modified to fit feminine norms, etc., but it is also considered acceptable, right? So all that I'm saying, the key point to remember over here is that the gender expression part at least applies to all of us to different degrees. um, Third, and the most important concept, I think, over here from the point of view of LGBT rights is of gender identity. So when we say, there's a certain biological sex assigned at birth, it does not just end there. It's not simply about the genitalia or about other organs of the body or the chromosomes, etc. It is also about our brains, because that in the brain is where our sense of self resides, and that is how we decide, how we perceive ourselves and how we relate even to ourselves and to the world around us. Um, and again, for like 99% of people, there is no difficulty here, in the sense that whatever the gender assigned to them at birth is the one that their brain also aligns with, and they continue to identify with it throughout their lives. However, for about 1%, and I mean, the numbers may differ in different kinds of surveys, etc., but I'm just like throwing an approximate number out there, that for a small fraction of people, um, there might be a misalignment at that level, that the brain tells you something different, which your body does not agree with, right? So your body and the rest of society and everyone else is telling you you're a boy, but your brain tells you that no, you're a girl, or vice versa, right? Someone who has the body of and is being raised as a girl, etc., but who in their own fundamental sense of self and from their brain, etc., everything just tells them that they're a boy. So it can work both ways, right? And that is where the concept of trans people comes from. And again, I mean, the analogous term for it, which applies to the rest of society, where their identities align, is cisgender. So anyone who was assigned, for example, as female at birth, and said that, oh, it's a girl, and then continues to identify as a girl throughout their lives, would be a cisgender girl or a cisgender woman. And someone who was uh, assigned and seen as a boy, raised as a boy, etc. But then at some point of time asserts that no, they are a girl, they are a woman, and they want to live as one. And then to whatever extent they take steps to assert themselves, that person would be called a trans woman. And vice versa, those who are assigned at birth as male and then raised as boys, etc., and continue to identify as boys throughout their lives are cis boys or cis men. And similarly, those who are at birth and throughout childhood, etc., they might be raised as girls, but at some point they assert themselves as boys or as men, and they say they don't want to live as girls, they want to live as boys or as men, or trans men. So those are the broad four categories, and I mean we can all figure out where we might lie in each of them. However, uh, for another sort of segment out of all this, it might be the case that they might not identify with any of these boxes. Right. So they know that they do not agree with what was forced upon them at birth, what has been forced upon them through childhood, but they do not necessarily. They might use different terms to express themselves. They might say that they're genderqueer or androgynous or whatever. I mean, and so in each of these cases, just like there is intersex as a different category besides male and female in biological sex, there is androgynous besides masculine and feminine. Similarly, besides man and woman, there is also all the non-binary categories like genderqueer, etc. So these are the broad concepts, and again, I mean, all of these concepts are relevant to all of us, right? So when we look at all the different terms which are incorporated in whatever I said in the last few minutes, that includes all of us, right? So even if you do not identify as any part of the LGBT spectrum, that would still be considered a cisgender heterosexual person, a man or a woman. Right. And of course, the last bit is sexual attraction. But I mean, there are two different parts to it: sexual attraction and romantic attraction, and these could be different. Right. So, and over there, as you can see, that attraction could be only towards men, only towards women, towards both, or towards none, or towards any combination of these, basically, and including non-binary people and so on. So this is broadly the basis from which we can then start talking about all the different terms in that acronym, because I thought straight away jumping into that acronym would not make sense until these fundamental concepts were clarified. And I realize I have only about 15 minutes to go, so I'll hurry up a bit. So yeah, now coming to that acronym, and um, I mean, there's a certain history behind this acronym. So to some extent, when some people argue in India, at least, that this whole movement of queer rights, LGBT rights, etc., is a Western import, they are correct to the extent that the modern form of it, the pride parades and that modern form of asserting political rights and so on, did in fact arise out of the West. 1970s especially is when, you know, a lot of pride parades, etc., the pride flag and so on, started, especially in the US. But even in the US, the history actually predates even the 1970s. So in the 1960s itself, there were a couple of landmark incidents. There were the Stonewall riots and the Compton riot in New York and San Francisco, respectively, where queer people asserted themselves against police brutality and said that we will not continue to take things lying down. And so from that point onwards, it became more of a political movement rather than just being a hidden underground kind of culture. Um, so that part of asserting political rights in a certain form, of course, has then spread all over the world, including in India. However, India, of course, and a lot of other non-Western cultures have their own indigenous history of queer cultures of different kinds. Right. So one very visible form of it, of course, is all the trans people that we see begging on the street. And I mean, begging and sex work being assumed as the two stereotypical professions that they engage in. But of course, many of that community are educated to different degrees, have been in professions or are in professions other than begging and sex work. Many are respected activists and so on. And while I'm talking about this, let me also just be clear about how some of these stereotypes are presented in most of our mainstream media. So when we talk about these visible communities, you might ask, who are these people and where do they come from, and how does someone become a trans person, right? So the terms for each of these communities may differ in different parts of India. So Hijra or Kinnar in different parts of North and West India. And then there is and then there are terms which have been used in the past but which are considered impolite or have been rejected by the community itself. So Aravani, for example, which was used in Tamil Nadu, is now being asserted by a lot of people as a derogatory term and something which should not be used. Instead, Tirunangai, for example, or so there are different terms which are being asserted in different languages. And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar myself with all the different terms in the different regional languages, but all that I'm trying to say is that each state or each different culture within the country might have its own terms for it and its own stories, its own mythology. So I do know. I mean, even if I may not be fully, be able to name all the terms right now, I do know for a fact that besides the North Indian terms, Hijra and Kinnar, there are terms used in Tamil Nadu. There are terms, of course, used in Karnataka, even in Manipur, and in different parts of the country, as I've said. Now, these communities are actually not, I mean, we can't simply just place them in that diagram that we just saw in the previous slide. They are actually an amalgam of different kinds of people who land up in the community for different reasons. So there are, when I was talking about intersex children, for example, where at birth itself, some sort of ambiguity is seen, there might be a lot of cases where the parents say that, no, this child is still ours and we will raise the child one way or the other. However, many might just reject the child from that point itself, from birth itself, and might just give them to the trans community. So a small fraction of these communities might be those who are intersex and who have been there almost their entire lives. A much bigger fraction is of people who are thrown out of their homes, typically those who are being raised as boys, who are being forced to live as boys, but who are extremely effeminate, who are either identifying, as trans women openly, as trans girls openly from that age itself, or come to that kind of assertion later. But basically being thrown out of their homes in childhood or in teenage, etc., and then having nowhere to go, landing up in these communities. Um, and then like the communities have had their own traditional indigenous sort of methods of trying to help a person transition in some way, even before the modern medical practices around it emerged. And so therefore, if it is assumed, if it is believed that many of these people do look a certain way, which does not clearly lie within the boundaries of male or female as is commonly understood, that might be because of because these traditional methods, and just it's not about the methods and the details of those, but broadly the fact that these identities and this entire culture has existed not just for decades but for centuries, right? And not just in India but in different indigenous cultures around the world. um, yeah Now coming back to these terms that I was talking about in this acronym. So given this history that this is how these cultures have existed and this movement started, initially, from the 1970s, 80s onwards, what happened in the West was that um, trans and other identities got sidelined, and mainly it became a movement of gay men initially, and then lesbian women who were able to blend and present a certain acceptable image in society. And then that is something which is continuously being expanded and questioned, that what exactly is even acceptable, and why should we still be forcing people into some boxes or the other, if that is against the whole point of the movement. So initially it was just considered the gay rights movement. Then it became, gay men and lesbian women. But then there were bisexual people who um, were, included in this. So then it became LGB, and then the trans people started saying that no, I mean, we have been there from the beginning and we can't be excluded. So that's how it became LGBT. But now Q stands here for queer, or some people say questioning, and queer could be either an umbrella term to include everyone. So instead of saying that okay, we'll go on expanding the acronym until we have 10, 15, 20 letters, instead let's just say queer, right? Let's just use that as an umbrella term. Or it could also mean, as I said, gender queer being used as a term by people who say we are, we do not identify with either being male or female, we'll just call ourselves gender queer. So queer can also be used in that sense. I, of course, for intersex, which is something I've explained already, and A for asexual. So in the previous slide, when we were talking about being attracted to nobody, right? And this is different from celibacy in the sense that, if those who choose not to marry all their lives, etc., that is a certain form of celibacy, which has been part of mainstream cultures. But not just making that choice, but even just fundamentally not being able to experience attraction in the same way that the rest of society does. And saying that it's okay to feel that way. It is not something which needs to be corrected, or something which a psychologist or a therapist needs to sort of somehow get you out of, and so on. So and therefore asexuality as an identity in itself. So I've just left it at that, and then left a plus sign over there to include all the other identities that could be possible. But of course, I mean, if you look around on Google, there are other versions of the acronym which could go on and on. The point here is not to remember what that acronym is about. The point here is that, excuse me, that the whole reason why this movement has come about is because people are saying that we do not fit in the usual boxes which are imposed on us. And so we want to be able to openly say what exactly we identify with, how it does not fit with the expectations imposed on us, and so on. And so different forms of these identities, different combinations of it, and so on, may keep emerging. And the terminology around it might keep changing, even for those of us who are part of the movement. Like I might feel that when I, like 5 years ago, for example, what I knew about what are acceptable terms or not may change now. So it's not just about keeping myself updated, and not just about always finding out what is the latest thing that is going on. The fundamental thing to remember in such a case is the last point over there, that when you're in doubt, just ask. If you're looking at a person and like, it's not just about looking at a person and seeing that, okay, you cannot immediately place them into one category or the other. It's maybe just a good practice for everyone to just say, okay, these are my pronouns. So for example, if I introduce myself, ideally in that introduction itself, I should have said, I am Chithra and my pronouns are she and her. Right. And someone else may say my pronouns are he and him. And some others may say, actually, I don't want either of those pronouns. I'll just use they and them. Right. And then there are people who argue that no, they and them is very confusing, because if you use it for a singular person when it is actually used for plural, then it just confuses people, which is actually not true. I mean, just imagine the situation that someone has left a book, for example, in front of you in your home or in your class or something, and you don't know who it is. You don't know if it was a boy or girl who left it. Basically, you have no clue about the person. You'll say that someone has left their book, right? You will not, ideally, you should not assume that someone has left his book or her book, right? And just saying that his or her book, again, it becomes unwieldy if you always put his/her in all kinds of sentences. Instead, what is a perfectly acceptable English sentence is someone has left their book here on the table, and we are referring to a single person here, but we are using they for them, right? So just like they is used in that sense, in a case where you do not know which person you're talking about and of what gender they identify with. Similarly, there are people who might just take it as their identity and say they and them are my pronouns. That's it. So please use that for me, right? So yeah, and as I said, that it is a good practice for all of us to say this, so that it's not like some people have to assert it separately and the others are just assuming a certain kind of normalcy. It's just a better idea for everyone to say that, okay, these are my pronouns, and just state them up front. Yeah, and as I said before, that there are terms, analogous terms, which are used to describe the mainstream as well. So when we talk about homosexuality, and this homosexuality is this and that and blah 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 and all the nonsense with which the likes of Baba Ramdev and Subramanian Swami or whoever the hell have their opinions on, and pardon my language, but have their opinions on all of this. Uh, there is actually an analogous term called heterosexuality for the rest of society as well. So it's not simply that we just say normal, or we don't just say straight people or whatever. There is actually an analogous term called heterosexuality, and that is as much of an identity, a category, or something which someone chooses to belong to, as homosexuality or bisexuality or asexuality or whatever it is, right? It's the only difference is that because it is considered as the norm, people don't think about it, right? So we may ask a queer person, oh, when did you realize you were queer, and when did you come out to yourself, when did you come out to your parents, and so on. We could probably ask the same question to heterosexual people, right? When did you realize that you are indeed heterosexual and not queer? And similarly, cisgender as the term for all the people who agree with the gender that they have been born and raised into and assigned at birth and so on, and never sort of express displeasure with it or a disagreement with it. And the last point over here to remember is that which terms should not be used. I mean, besides the obvious slurs, and I'm sure, I hope I don't have to go through all the actual slurs, etc. I mean, of course, we must have heard of them in all kinds of places, in our school playgrounds, in our online spaces, and all kinds of, and obviously very hurtful words. But also, even as I said, like in different languages, there are terms which are being rejected. Even in English, for example, from the colonial times, the term eunuch was used, right? Which trans people have rejected across the board, whether in India or abroad. Everywhere, the term eunuch is typically rejected. And no one really wants to. I mean, people say that don't call us by these terms which we have never chosen for ourselves, which have been imposed on us by someone else. And not just the colonial times, but like those same terms have carried over and have been used even by the Indian government, for example, in their some of their policies or literature, etc., even till about, say, 10 years ago, right? And it is only in the last 8 to 10 years that the trans community has openly opposed it, and then the government and the courts, etc., have started using the right terms for them, and then it has become about transgender rights, and the Transgender Rights Act, which is actually a very problematic act. But I'll leave that discussion for now because I think we're running out of time. So yeah, I mean, this was broadly the thing. And sorry, one last thing which I forgot to cover earlier is using something as an adjective versus as a noun. So the correct term, for example, is transgender people. Just like we say gay men, right? It's not those gays, right? It's those gay men, for example, right? So similarly, it's transgender men, transgender women, transgender people, or trans person. That is the correct usage. Transgenders is not correct usage, right? So it's not a noun. None of these terms are nouns. They are all adjectives, and therefore they should be used as such, right? So for the mainstream society, for example, it would not simply be heterosexuals or straights or whatever, right? It would be heterosexual people, right? Or heterosexual men or heterosexual women, or whatever the context we may be talking in. So that is one important point to remember. And of course, you may see different forms of it. Sometimes. So if a person is using this term, if a person is saying for themselves that I am a transgender or something like that, that could be their own way of self-identifying, or more likely it is that maybe they are not as comfortable with the English language as you are. But assuming that everyone here has a certain degree of familiarity with the English language, this is an important point to remember, that the correct usage is as adjectives. And I mean, that's how, as far as possible, it should be used. And a lot of people, like something which applies to them as a description, they may not necessarily use it as an identity all the time. Right. So if the full description, for example, of say a person who is listening to this talk right now would be a cisgender heterosexual boy or man, or a cisgender heterosexual girl or woman, that is not how you always identify yourself in all spaces, right? You just say, I am a boy, I'm a girl, I'm a man, I'm a woman, whatever, right? So similarly, the same applies to trans people. That there are many who may just like, even if the category of trans woman applies to them, they might just say, I am a woman, right? And that's all that matters. Beyond that, whether or not they talk about being trans, about their history, about their gender transition, or about a history which is frankly nobody's business, is up to them, and it depends on the context, and it depends on their comfort. Right. So that is another point to remember, that what applies to someone as a description may not always be what they consider as something that they always identify with. And therefore, in all of these cases, if all of this sounds very confusing, the last point over here is the most important one. When in doubt, just ask. Right. So given this, it's already 4:46, and I could just go on and on about these other points. I think I'll just cover this quickly in a couple of minutes. So I hope I don't have to go over outright violence, discrimination, rejection, abuse, hatred, bigotry, etc., or outright slurs. All of those are, of course, unacceptable behaviors. I mean, there's no question about that. But there is something far simpler and far more common, far more everyday, which comes under this category called microaggressions, right? Which we may not even realize that we are doing unless someone points it out to us, right? So we have this certain notion of what a gay man would look like, or what a lesbian woman would look like, and these things which I've put over there under quotation marks are actual things which people have shared, uh, you know amongst us, that these are things which we hear all the time from well-meaning people. So there is no such thing as looking gay, right? I mean, there are all kinds of gay people, and you may not even know if someone around you is gay until they tell you. And they will, of course, not tell you if they feel uncomfortable by some such language. Or, girls, queer girls get this all the time, that, oh, you are so pretty, how can you be lesbian? I mean, I can't even get into how absurd it is, being a lesbian woman myself, that, how to what, like, it's just amusing, but it's also like, I don't even know how to even, yeah, but the point is that these things are said, and ideally they shouldn't be said. Or in the case of trans people, there are trans women who are, quote unquote, pretty by mainstream standards, etc. There are trans men who are like, bodybuilders or whatever, like, hunky actors, models, etc. So in both directions, there are people who may appear a certain way, and you may not be able to guess that they're trans. But the point is not to guess, not to look at someone and guess what they are, who they are, or what their history is like, what they look like as children, and so on, or ask them what was their name earlier, or have they had surgeries or not, or can I see your childhood photos, all of those things. In all these cases, the simple thumb rule to remember is that if something would be unacceptable to ask a cis person, the same thing is also unacceptable to ask a trans person. And in general, it also applies for queer people in general, for gay and lesbian people, for all kinds of queer people, that if it is unacceptable to say to a heterosexual person, it is unacceptable to say to a queer person. So just as a quick example, just like we do not go around among cis people, we do not go around asking, oh, what is inside your pants, right? And so therefore, it's just so absurd to even say or to be heard in common conversation. Therefore, it is equally absurd to ask a trans person whether or what kind of surgeries they've had or what it was like and so on. If they are really, really close to you, if they think you need to know, they will tell you themselves, right? But we as friends, as allies, as colleagues, as family members or whatever, I mean, family, of course, it becomes more complicated in many ways, but otherwise in all other kinds of relations, it is perfectly unacceptable, completely unacceptable to ask such questions. So specific details of transitions or even reactions to same-sex advances. Now, this is something which, I've heard a lot, that uh, with both heterosexual men and women, more so from men, that, oh, I'm actually okay with gay rights, with LGBT rights. It's just that they should not hit on me. Right. So I had this one gay friend who was hitting on me, and therefore I'm completely spooked out and I don't like them, and so on and so forth. Or vice versa, if a girl says the same thing, that, oh, there was this one girl in my college or in my hostel or who was hitting on me or something, and I found it really weird. Um, that in itself is a problem as well. I mean, of course, I'm not implying that you do not have a right to stand up for yourself, reject such an advance, but just like as long as that advance or request or whatever, flirting, whatever it is made politely, is not abusive, is not problematic in some other way. If it is just some, if it's done in a polite manner, then it needs to be reacted in that same manner. So just like between a boy and a girl, if such an advance is politely dealt with, the same standards should apply in the same-sex case as well, even if you yourself are heterosexual, right? And it's not like you don't need to get worried about, oh, do I look like this? Why did this person? No, it's okay. I mean, they were taking their chances. They failed at that chance. Just let them be, right? Instead of making it worse for them. If, of course, someone is abusive, someone is threatening in some way, and that could be anyone. It could be a heterosexual person or a queer person, anyone. Then, of course, that needs to be dealt with differently, and that is never okay, no matter who it is. And outing anyone without their consent, of course, is not okay. So even if someone has shared something in confidence with you, come out to you, just imagine the courage it must have taken them to tell you such a thing. And then that is something which you need to completely hold on, and like hold their trust, and not something that you should violate and go around sharing with friends. So just assuming that it is okay to tell, I'll tell this one friend because they will not tell anyone. I mean, that is completely not okay, because that is exactly how the grapevine spreads. You think that person will not spread. It's just best to keep your mouth shut, right? until the friend, whoever is coming out to you explicitly says so. Right. So if they say that, oh, actually, I want to come out to the whole class, but I can't do it. I'm coming out to you, and now you help me figure out, how we'll come out to everyone else in some such scenario. Or if they say it's okay, I've come out to you, and I don't care who you tell. If they clearly say that, then it is different. But otherwise, even if they have not explicitly stated, the assumption should always be that this is something to be kept private with you, unless they themselves want to share it. And finally, as allies, the most important point to remember, and this is not just about allies in the context of queer rights, it is also about allies in the context of, say, gender justice more broadly, or in the context of whether it's religion, class, caste, language, whatever. In any other form, if you are part of a privileged segment and you feel that it is your duty to talk about other rights and to stand up for them and so on, at the end of the day, all of these movements and all these issues, they are about justice, right? And so making it look like a charitable act and expecting some brownie points for it or expecting some publicity for it and so on is not okay. And it is also not okay to take space and go on talking about these issues when you know that there are others with that actual lived experience who can talk about it. So it is always best to hear all of these things from the people themselves who have lived through it, rather than this notion of expertise. I mean, expertise of course applies in certain technical domains, etc., but in the context of these movements and these rights, there's no such thing as expertise. What is far more valuable is people's lived experiences, and respecting them, and completely accepting all of those experiences as valid. And the key point here that I said is acceptance and not tolerance. You're not simply tolerating the existence of certain people, you are accepting everyone as part of this same society. So, sorry, I have taken, instead of 40 minutes, I've taken 56 minutes. There are only 4 minutes left. But of course, I am free to stay on for a few more minutes, even 10, 15 more minutes if there are questions. And so now I'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any, you can ask them directly on the, through the mic, or you can type them out. Either way is fine with me. Thank you.
Thank you for that session. So while people write their questions in the chat box, or they can also raise their hand so that we can unmute you. So while they do that, I asked, what would be the top 5 improvements that you would have observed in our society in respect of being more inclusive towards people of the LGBTQIA community?
Okay. Sorry, I think the network was slightly bad, so I'll just repeat to confirm whether I've understood the question correctly. So yeah, are you saying top 5 improvements? Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, the whole struggle is still ongoing. It is still, I mean, all of these questions, these issues are still quite relevant. But I mean, definitely victories have been achieved. Progress has been made. So, of course, many of you might know of the historic, Supreme Court judgment in September 2018, where the Section 377 was read down. So it was not completely removed, but it was read down to the extent that consensual acts are okay. Non-consensual acts, of course, are not okay, whether it is Section 377 or, of course, other sections against sexual violence. So that, of course, was a historic judgment. And if we might think that, oh, we are far behind the rest of the world and so on, that is not the case. So even in the US, for example, which I was, holding as that is where this movement started, etc., different progressive state governments, different states had started making some progress from like 40, 50 years ago. But the US Supreme Court finally ruled only in 2003 that, the analogous judgment, just like our Section 377, the judgment over there, which is called Lawrence versus Texas, was in 2003. And then, of course, within 12 years after that, in 2015, was the judgment about gay marriage, right? And yeah, I mean, here, that is still an ongoing battle. I mean, there are people who are saying that, we are preparing for a fight to have gay marriage recognized and so on. And when we talk about this, it is not simply about, um, you know, um, like people just getting to celebrate their weddings in the same way that heterosexual people do. It is also about serious questions that come up at different points of life, right? So couples which have literally spent their entire lives together, 25, 30 years together, might not be able to even, if one person, and in old age, of course, if one person falls ill, the other person may not, despite being their partner for their entire lives, may not be allowed to take care of them. And instead, the doctors or the entire system may say, no, 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 the family needs to get involved. Inheritance, of course, is, whether it's inheritance or getting a joint account or in insurance, etc., having one or the other as the nominee. A lot of these things which are just assumed to be a normal thing for a married couple whose marriage has been recognized by the state. These things are completely, unimaginable. I mean, and huge struggles for queer people. So there are struggles like these. Excuse me. But yeah, not just in the context of that specific section and about sexual acts, but just broadly this acceptance of identities. And we are seeing this shift in every generation, right? So in your generation, it is very, very different from what it was in colleges 10, 15, 20 years ago. And just broadly in society, right? So I was in college about 15. I mean, college not in the sense that I'm doing my PhD even now, but for example, I was an undergrad about 15 years ago, and it was a very, very different time when it was not possible for most people to come out and so on, right? So in that sense, of course, a huge shift has happened. There is more visibility, of course, in mainstream culture and media. So after the 2018 judgment, we have had mainstream movies, right? So it's no longer about movies like Fire, which are a certain, art house kind of cinema, and then there is a huge protest against it and all of that. I mean, now we have movies like Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga, or this one, what was this Irish one? Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, right? So there are movies like these which are being made and talked about as part of the mainstream movies and in mainstream theaters and so on. So there are all of these shifts. I can't really list a top 5 over here, but these are some important shifts which I have seen even in the last 10, 15 years, and I think that is quite significant.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. If possible, would you be able to share a little about your journey as an activist?
Oh, okay. No, so I had thought of keeping this not about my own journey and not about my personal whatever. But I mean, if this question has come up, I'll talk about it briefly. So for me, this journey started only about 5, 6 years ago, when I started coming to terms with myself, right? And so this is, I think, one important part which I think I forgot to talk about in my talk as well, that it is not simply that someone may know from childhood itself or from teenage itself or something. Of course, there are people who fit that usual stereotype and who assert themselves from a very early age. But there are also people. So, for example, in my school, the most effeminate boys that I can remember, to the best of my knowledge, they are heterosexual, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there might be cases someone is closeted, etc. But to the best of my knowledge, they are heterosexual. Uh, in my own case, people did not see me as queer, right? And I did not see myself as queer until much later in life. And so even whether it's the stereotype of what a lesbian woman looks like or what a trans person looks like and so on, sorry, I do not fit those usual stereotypes. And so it was a little, surprising for my old friends when I came out to them. But largely, it has been a journey of acceptance. Almost most people who I knew earlier have accepted and have remained friends and so on. And so just to clarify, when I was using these terms for myself, so I am trans lesbian. And so that is one example that in that acronym, both L and T apply to me, right? So just like a cis woman could be heterosexual or could be lesbian, just like a cis man could be gay or heterosexual, similarly, trans women can also be straight in the sense that they are attracted to men, or trans women can be lesbian and attracted to other women. And the same can is the case for trans men as well. So trans men also could be attracted to anyone and so on and so forth. So yeah, so trans lesbian is the identity term that I sort of identify with. And because it was such a complicated thing to understand that, because forget about trans lesbian, even about lesbians in general or about trans people in general, there was barely any literature or media or anything to sort of understand it in the 90s or even the early 2000s. So it's only about the last 10 years or so that it has become possible to be able to process all of these things, and then it sort of became possible for me to accept myself. When that happened, I decided, I sought out help from my campus therapist and so on, and then we decided to start this campus queer resource group called I Am Ally, which you had talked about in my intro. And then from there, I have come in touch with a lot of people, queer activists, from across the country, across the community. And so that is, in short, what my journey is about. I don't want to get into details of protests and issues and movements and so on. I mean, because that will be a long thing.
Thank you. We have a question from Sindhu.
Yeah.
Sindhu says, hello, ma'am. Can you please share your thoughts on the 2019 trans bill and why it's problematic?
Yeah. So I'll just, I mean, there are so many parts to the bill and it's problematic in so many ways that, I could just go on about it for a couple of hours. But I will highlight the most problematic aspects of it. Sorry. First of all, it is in defining trans people itself. I mean, we are still not sure after the 2014 Supreme Court judgment, Nalsa versus Union of India, then the 2015 private members bill in the Rajya Sabha, which was presented by a DMK member, and then it was passed. And then the entire battle in Lok Sabha from 2016 till 2019, and then that bill, becoming an act finally, and then the Rajya Sabha, the 2019 Rajya Sabha, of course, was very different from the 2015 one. So that Rajya Sabha also choosing to pass this same problematic act. In this entire conversation, we are not sure whether the government has even understood who trans people are. So a lot of these conversations, the pronouncements by the government, if you actually look at them carefully, or the language used, etc., you will realize that they are confused between trans and intersex people. Right. So if they think that, oh, there are people who have an intersex condition or something or the other, and this is how they are since birth, and then in our Ramayana, this is what happened, this is what Lord Ram said, and blah, blah, blah. And there are all those kinds of stories which you will hear even in the parliamentary debates, etc., which are frankly not relevant. I mean, we are talking of the present day, we are talking of rights in the present context. It's not about what was said in what mythology. Even if that was not said, those rights would still be relevant today. And so they have, completely missed the fact that a lot of trans people do not want this separate third category. Certainly, that third category called T should be created for those who want that and who want to identify with it. But for a lot of us, it's simply about being able to go from M to F or F to M without much trouble, right? So for a lot of trans women, it's just about, if they have M on their IDs and they have a name which they don't relate with anymore, you just want to be able to change it and just get F on all their IDs. And there are, practical issues involved over here. So from the perspective of psychiatrists and other kinds of doctors and people who are involved in this process of transition in both directions, um, the shift in the last few decades has been that uh, it is finally the person's right to decide. So a psychiatrist or some other expert does not get to sit and evaluate that, oh, did you play with dolls as a child? Did you play with this and that? And were you tomboyish? Were you this and that? That is complete nonsense. Just like those questions are complete nonsense. If, I mean, a cis woman, for example, could say, I don't want to play with dolls. I just want to play with cars or, play football or something or the other. And she could still continue to identify her whole life as a woman. The same thing applies to a trans woman and vice versa to a trans man, right? So someone who may be raised as a girl, who may do stereotypically feminine activities, but who may still go on to identify as a man later in life. So finally, after a lot of struggles, etc., the so-called experts have finally come to the conclusion that people have the right to decide for themselves. Now, given this, the job of a psychiatrist is never to certify that, oh, this person is this or that. Their job is only to say that this person is not suffering from any other, psychiatric conditions or complications which could make this journey difficult for them. They are ready to take this journey and they are willingly consenting to it and they know all the consequences and so on and so forth. That's all that the role of a psychiatrist is. And so given this, because fundamentally it is about a person's choice, therefore it is not the job of a psychiatrist, not the job of a doctor, definitely not the job of a bureaucrat or anyone else to be certifying these identities, right? And that is what this bill brings in, this act brings in, that you have to go and apply it to the district magistrate and this and that. And I mean, we know how bureaucracy runs in this country, frankly. So even to get your simple, I mean, I don't know how many of you have had to change your address in your Aadhaar or something or the other, and simple address updates are so, such a huge headache for so many people. So expecting, someone to jump through all the hoops for something like this is complete nonsense. What is the alternative? The alternative is what was already happening after the 2014 judgment. A lot of trans people, because the 2014 judgment and the 2015 Rajya Sabha bill were actually quite progressive in their whole understanding of this issue. And they said people have the right to decide. How do you decide? How do you assert that decision? You go and make a legal sort of affidavit, which is a statement, a sworn statement. You believe it to be true that this is how I identify, and therefore this is how I'm going to live my whole life, and so on. Right. And then based on that, you can then change your name, put newspaper ads or whatever you want to do, get a notification in the state gazette, central gazette, all of those things. But instead of simply relying on this process of having a sworn affidavit, now they have made it all about go and apply to the district magistrate. And first they will give you a T. Then after that, once you have all the surgeries, then they will give you an F. I mean, for those who are going from M to F, and vice versa for those who are going from F to M. But a lot of people can't afford these surgeries. They can't afford these procedures. And they might still have gone through some steps of the process, right? So, for example, someone who is going through a hormone replacement therapy, as it is called, HRT, in either direction, will visibly change, right? So will visibly start looking as a woman or will visibly start looking as a man. So for a trans man, for example, their voice will drop, they'll get facial hair and so on. Short hair is usually something they would have done on their own anyways. And wearing different clothes, etc. They might be doing all of that. But yeah, I mean, so some of these changes will happen and therefore they will be seen by society in that way, right? So it'll be extremely impossible and difficult for a trans man who looks like that to then be forced to go into a women's security queue or a women's restroom or something like that. And then having the wrong IDs, having IDs which still say F, is a huge problem for them. And similarly, in the case of trans women who may still be carrying around IDs which say M, but who look and who are treated as women, right? So even in my own case, in my own transition, I thought that given my voice, and I don't know, I mean, I believe that my voice is enough to tell people that I'm trans. So earlier, I thought that therefore I can use this voice to pass off as a guy longer than I need to as a man. But I realized that that was not possible, because if I go into airport security and I'm not talking, like if I'm alone, I'm not just talking to myself, right? I'm just silently standing over there. The guards would just say, "Ma'am, please go to the other queue." And then like all these men around would be looking at me, and then I would be like, I'm wearing like this shirt and trousers or whatever, but still I'm being seen and treated as a woman, and therefore at some point I just had to make this switch. So this whole process happens anyway. I mean, once you take that plunge, it happens anyway. It does not wait for you to get the right IDs. So the objective of the government should be to help this process of getting the right IDs as easily as possible, as soon as possible, and not making it contingent on surgery, not making it contingent on getting these documents and applying over here and there, and all that nonsense. So yeah, so that is the most fundamental problem. Sorry, I'm just taking too long. Second problem, which is there is, and I can see there's one more person who has their hand raised. We'll come to that quickly. The second very important problem is when it comes to the laws about violence, right? Sexual violence particularly. So, I mean, we know that the standard section 375, for rape cases, for example, it defines rape, first of all, is defined as something, committed by a man on a woman. And there is, of course, a certain reason why it is that way. Now, if you were to include trans women in that definition, first of all, it is not clear whether the law as it exists under those sections includes trans women or not, or includes even trans men, for example, or includes all kinds of people who could be victims. And what they have said instead is that similar violence against trans people will be punishable with up to 2 years. So basically, 7 years if it is a cis woman, 2 years if it is a trans woman. And that has caused a huge uproar, because you are directly codifying it in law that different punishments for the same act based on who is being targeted. And when this was raised in parliament, the minister actually said, no, this is only for sadharan chhedchhad. And then of course there was an uproar that, okay, when it is with trans people, it is considered sadharan chhedchhad or something. So there is a lot of confusion in the minds of the people who have made this law about the nature of sexual violence and the nature of harassment and discrimination and abuse faced by trans people. And very measly punishments have been prescribed, and even that implementation, we don't know how good or bad it will be. And so instead of that, people were saying, just instead of this whole certification process, make it a simple process of people self-identifying themselves. Just make your existing sexual violence laws inclusive of all kinds of victims. Even if you still define the perpetrator as only a man, that is one thing, but at least from the victim's perspective, you should be able to include all kinds of victims and so on. So there were many such arguments, and these were raised time and time again over those 4 years in representations to the parliamentary committees, etc. People have gone and spoken to the politicians involved. People have protested on the streets. All kinds of things have happened across the country. And despite all of that has been ignored. And instead, the act was passed and it has been celebrated as a great victory and so on and so forth. And why it is being done and how it fits into the broader narrative of what is happening in politics in this country, I'll not get into, but of course, that is a discussion for another day. Sorry, I think we'll come to Pavitra's question, who has their hand raised since a long time.
Yeah, I've unmuted you, or you can talk, Pavitran.
Yeah, thank you, Sharanya. Good evening, Chithra ma'am. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I'm Pavitran, and yeah, I would like to use the pronouns they or him. I have two questions to you. I think you would pardon me for that. So one question is, I know I'm a proud member of queer community, and I know we in our organization we usually have a debate on adding pedophiles to the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. Um, as a community member researching on LGBTQIA plus terminologies, I know there is a lot of gray area which is still left out. But what is your take on adding pedophiles to our spectrum, this sexuality minority spectrum?
So my own personal take, of course, is that no matter what, all the other definitions of what is acceptable and so on, that they have shifted, and it is good that they have shifted. One thing which has thankfully not shifted and should not shift is the definition of consent, and consent not just as actual expressly spoken consent between adults and so on, but statutory, like if legally a person below 18 cannot it's not, it's assumed that they cannot consent, so that's the end of it, right? So, and therefore any sort of um, sexual relations or whatever with an underage person is simply not okay. If both people are underage, and of course, I mean, that is the reality that a lot of teenagers get into, all that is a different matter. But between an adult and an underage person, that is my strict view. However, I do know that there do exist some debates and some arguments that pedophiles, in the sense of people who are attracted but who acknowledge that attraction and who are responsible in sort of accepting it and talking about it and so on, are very different from predators, right? And so someone may not openly admit and accept that they are attracted, they are pedophiles, but they might still indulge in predatory behavior. And I feel that dealing with predators, definitely in the context of pedophilia, but also in a broader context of predators of any kind, even those who are, like targeting adults and so on, predators need to be dealt with the same way that predators are, are dealt with in general when it comes to sexual violence. And I mean, that process in itself can be better, and we can talk about restorative justice rather than simply punishing and incarcerating people and so on. But I am otherwise like, so I do understand that there are people who say that no, we are not predators, we are not going to act on it, but we are not afraid to admit that we are attracted to children. um, I feel that okay, I mean, I can understand where they're coming from, but I would be very uncomfortable in including that identity as part of the queer umbrella. And it is also not just about um, pedophilia. It is also, I mean, so there are other relatively more innocuous kinds of identities. Excuse me. There are polyamorous people, there are people into different kinds of kinks and so on, who may also feel the same need for a community and all that. And I do understand that to some extent, especially around polyamory, etc., there is space that could be made within the queer community, etc. But we have to be careful. Just like in the context of pedophilia, we have to distinguish between those who are talking about it in a respectable manner versus those who are predators. Similarly, in the context of polyamory and so on, I mean, there have to be far more open discussions about consent and how consent works when multiple people are involved. It is far more complicated then, rather than just letting those identities become an excuse for people to engage in all kinds of unethical behavior. So for example, if you are dating two people at the same time and one of them does not know about the other, that is not okay, right? No matter how you may define yourself. So if everyone involved knows what is going on, then that is a different matter. Then it's okay. But yeah, so those ethical boundaries need to be very clear, right? So So that is one part. The other part is that besides pedophilia, besides polyamory, there are also other kinds of terms which people just completely, come up with. So I came across a term called scoliosexual something, right? Where basically sorry, the, okay, am I being asked to stop now? Sorry. Okay.
No, not at all. We still, you can finish this question if that's okay.
Okay.
There's
Sorry.
no rush to end it.
Okay. Sorry. So, yeah, I don't remember the term clearly. The point I was making was that the definition of the term I remember was about attraction specifically to trans people. Now, that is something which is a very, very contentious issue because, a lot of trans women will say that, if we want to be seen as any other women, and if those who are attracted to straight men, for example, then, they would want to eventually find someone who just sees them as any other woman. And if that man is attracted to women, that definition can include trans women as well. But someone who says that, no, I'm not attracted to cis women, I'm attracted specifically to trans women, but then you ask them why. And then, if you have certain notions of how a trans woman would be different, and then it gets into questions of what do you like, because a person's like relation to their own body, and like it's the whole question of what a person looks like now, what they might look 5 or 10 years from now, etc., is much more complicated when it comes to trans people. So that whole debate gets much more muddled, and unfortunately the experience of a lot of trans people in this case is that people who identify in this manner as being attracted exclusively to trans people. There might be a few genuine people out there, but largely that is a cover used by predators, right? So then that is something which a lot of trans people would be uncomfortable with including this segment under the queer umbrella. They would say that these are just a variant of straight, of heterosexual people, and they don't need to be identified separately as such, and they definitely don't need to be included in the queer umbrella. So sorry, I moved on from your question of pedophilia, but I think it was important to talk about all these aspects as well. That some of these areas can actually get quite gray and quite contentious. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you, man.
Yeah. Okay.
And my second question is regarding Transgender Protection of Rights Bill, which usually passed down in Lok Sabha.
Yeah.
So I, as a part of my organization, we had interviewed many trans women, trans persons in particular, regarding their take on that bill. And one such important person, not trans person, I had a conversation with Ashok Rao Kavi sir. I think you may know him. So what his take was really surprising. He said instead of asking them to withdraw that bill completely, we would ask them to had trans members from the trans community itself to give certificate or so on, so that trans people will be a bit comfortable in dealing with them. So what is your take on that?
No, I do not agree with this. And so, first of all, I mean, a disclosure, I'll be very clear about this. I do not agree with the broader politics of whether it is Ashok Rao Kavi, Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, and a lot of other people, who have similar views on broader issues in general and not just queer rights. Coming specifically to this point, um, just like it is, I mean, when I said that it is finally about self-identification, it is not okay for an expert, a doctor, or a bureaucrat, or anyone to sit and certify it for you. By that, I did not just mean cisgender people, and I did not just mean heterosexual people. I mean any other person. So even another trans person does not get to certify for you. You get to certify it for yourself, right? Um, and why? Because there are very practical issues involved over here, because there are, of course, certain people who have fit the norm even from the 1950s 60s onwards, when the first medical modern form of medical transitions started occurring. There were people who fit that norm, that I played with or these kinds of toys as a child. This is how I dressed up. This is how I present myself. And so who jumped through all those hoops and who managed to, get whatever they wanted from the medical system and live their lives the way they wanted. If it was left to them to define who else should be included, then those who don't fit those boundaries so clear, I mean those categories so clearly, would have been left out forever, right? And just to take a very clear example, now if I say I am a trans lesbian, and if I feel that among a lot of straight trans women, it's just, forget about mainstream society, forget about other queer people, even for other trans women, it can be surprising to learn that, oh, trans women can also be lesbian and we are not attracted always only to men. So therefore, there are a lot of these frictions, a lot of these complexities. And so to assume, because it's not just that one person will sit and certify, right? Finally, a proper process would be that you have to have such people across 600, 700 districts of the country, and to be able to expect that you have that many people of any kind, whether they're trans people, cis people, whether they're experts, bureaucrats, whoever they are, in all places of the country, who will fairly certify all of this, is a huge stretch. That's not going to happen. And with self-identification, a common sort of misconception is that it will open the door for all kinds of abuse and so on. So frankly, I mean, someone who wants to use it as an excuse to be a predator or be an abuser will do it anyway. They don't need to, like, if the usual, argument that, oh, men can enter women's restrooms and, all kinds of things like that. Someone who's a predator will do that anyway. They will not go and, put an affidavit, change their IDs and all that, and then do it. They will do it anyway if they want to. And predatory behavior, no matter who indulges in it, should be punished, right? But keeping that aside, keeping that fact aside, that you already have laws against predatory behavior, for a lot of people it is just simply impossible to be able to afford surgeries. It is very difficult to get documents when you have been thrown out of the homes, etc., or you don't have the right IDs and so on. For all kinds of reasons, it can be very, very impractical, right? To just say that there will be a bureaucratic process like this, and you can just, you'll have to go and apply and so on. So yeah, I mean, for a cis person to change your name, if today one of you wants to change your name, you just go exactly the same process that you go and say that, uh, you know, file an affidavit, put a newspaper ad, then get a gazette notification. That exact same process should work for a trans person also. And then within that, changing the gender marker out of it is simply a very minor thing, which you don't need to make such a big deal about and get into a certification process and all that. And expecting that trans community members will do it, I mean, Ashok might argue that it might be a little more fair than, bureaucrats doing it or whatever, but at the end of the day, it will have its own set of problems, and huge problems. So the limited point that you, instead of rejecting the act completely, you could make a lot of changes to it, but those changes will be so many that it will be like a complete overhaul of the act. That is what is required. If not a complete withdrawal or a rejection, a huge overhaul of the act is required. Minor piecemeal changes here and there and such suggestions, frankly, will not be enough.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
I have one last question. Please pardon me for that.
Yeah, go on.
I know you have highlighted many problems which we queer people face. Even I am facing that now in my daily life.
Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for college or institution like MES or any other college, so that they can adopt certain rules or regulations or whatever to be more queer inclusive?
Mhm. So I would say that, I mean, so there are, of course, a lot of, I mean, if someone wants to actually sort of formulate policies, etc., there are, things you can search for online, how other colleges, other spaces have gone about it. So that is one part of it, where it's only about, written policies, etc. But even in day-to-day practices, right? I mean, I'll be very frank about it. In the IIM Ahmedabad campus, even if after some of us have come to understand that, So at an official level, there may not be any discrimination and so on. But in a very regular day-to-day, like, so when new students come in, for example, new student comes in, introduction happens, ragging may or may not happen. I mean, opinions may differ where, how much ragging happens and all, but introductions happen everywhere. And in introductions, you ask, Acha, what is your name? Where have you come from? Blah, blah, blah. And then if it's a boy, you'll ask, do you have a girlfriend? If it's a girl, you will ask, do you have a boyfriend? That is so, from such conversations itself, you are assuming that a person is heterosexual, right? And so if that is the norm, that, you know, it's not just about some of us who have been able to come out, who have that courage and so on. It is also about a lot of other people who are still in the closet and who do not feel confident in the current environment. It is for us to be able to create that kind of supportive and welcoming environment and say that it is okay, no matter who you are, no matter, you know, you want to tell us about your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, it's perfectly okay, you know, whatever you tell us. Or don't tell us. So there are so many of these ways, you know, in every such conversation, every such action on a day-to-day basis, as individuals, as students, or the teachers, authorities, for everyone, you know, that can be, you know, a thing to ask yourself, that am I being fair and am I being inclusive when I say something like this, when I take such a step or ask such a question. Right. So yeah, I mean, then we can get into specific details, specific scenarios, and so on. That would be an endless discussion. But this was one broad point which I wanted to make.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you so much for taking the extra time to answer all of our questions. It's such a relevant topic, and the fact that we all don't know much about it speaks a lot about how we need to be more educated about it. So thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to all of us, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I
So
call Vaishnavi to present the word of thanks.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
yes.
Okay. I'm Vaishnavi, Youth Service Director of MES Rotaract Club. I would like to propose vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of MES Rotaract Club, may like to express our sincere thanks to Chithra Mathur ma'am for sharing her time to educate us about these sensitive topics which are usually misrepresented everywhere. Thank you so much, ma'am. I thank our faculty coordinator, Rotarian Veena Nagaraj ma'am, for constantly supporting us, and Rotarian Sumati Rao ma'am, President of our parent club, Rotary Bangalore Northwest, Rotarian Sarasija ma'am, Youth Service Director of our parent club, for attending today's event. I thank HOD of Psychology Department, Anita ma'am, and Charumati ma'am, who is a lecturer of Psychology Department from our MES college. I also thank our DRR Rajvamshi sir, DRS Arun sir, and ZRR Srinidhi sir for attending today's event. Last but not the least, I thank all our Rotaractors from various clubs, all the presidents and secretaries from various clubs who are here. Thank you for attending today's session. I hope you all had a great time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. Just one small reminder to all the attendees here uh, about our fellowship event that's coming up on the 24th, 25th, and 26th. If you haven't already registered, please do register, or you can ask me for the link so that you can do it. Thank you so much. Once again, a huge thanks to Chithra ma'am for spending so much of her time to educate all of us. Huge thanks, ma'am.
Thank you all. And are we done? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a
Thank
good
you. Bye.